This video focuses on Alfred Lord Tennyson's two poems, The Lotos-Eaters and Ulysses. Some context for thinking about the poems. We're in the Victorian age now in British literature. The quote at the opening of this slide is one that I referred to the other day from Twain, looking at the rapid change in England in the 19th century. I'll add to that too a statement from Walter Besant, who said, "So completely transformed were the mind and habits of the ordinary Englishman by 1897 that he would not, could he see him, recognize his own grandfather." Things had changed so much in England. And what was it that changed British society? Obviously, technology of the time period, steam power that brought about the introduction of the railways, the telegraph, so increasing communications with other parts of the world too, intercontinental cable, photography, and universal compulsory education. England too was the first country to industrialize. In thinking about the Victorians, these are some qualities that we oftentimes see connected to the Victorians. This is a list from the Norton, and earnestness, a feeling of moral responsibility, domestic propriety, very serious in their intent and purpose, and then proper manners and respectability. And this context, I think, is important for thinking about both of these poems, but particularly the Lotos-Eaters. And I want to give you a little bit of a framework for thinking about the Victorian era, and this will play a role too, especially in the Lotos-Eaters. The early period, 1830 to 1848, a time of troubles. There you see the expansion of the railway, growth of industrialized cities. Unrest, though, among working men who did not have a say in government, a vote. The reform bills are listed there with the dates. We move on to the mid-Victorian period too, a period of economic prosperity. This is also the period when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. It's also a period too where we're seeing a great outflux of people from England moving to the colonies throughout the world, and an outflux too of money going out of England as well. And these two facts are going to be key too when we get to some of the readings at the end of the semester about the British Empire. It's during this period too. Actually, the two poems here today I think are very reflective more of the mid-Victorian period, although the dates don't fit in exactly. But what I want to emphasize is the Victorian complacency, which and the nature of work too. So maybe an overlap between early period and mid-Victorian. But both of those kind of themes are apparent in these two poems. Then the late period, this is not an area we're going to cover in this course though, but a period of decay of Victorian values. Just some context for Tennyson and his life, so you can get some framework for thinking here. I'm going to just cover a couple of these things, though, point out that he did come from a very large family, but he was one who was able to receive a college education. When he was at college, he met a guy who became a very close friend of his, Arthur Hallam. I mention him because Tennyson's best-known poem, In Memoriam, a long elegy to his friend, is probably his best-known work. Hallam was to marry Tennyson's sister, but he died suddenly before the wedding took place. That poem had a great impact on Queen Victoria, whose husband Prince Albert was very taken with Tennyson's work, but after the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria was very moved by In Memoriam and actually granted him too some, awarded him with some British awards that, not literary awards, but not quite a knighthood, but close to a knighthood, because of the admiration she had for him. Now, he was, in fact, though, named as Poet Laureate right after Wordsworth, but he is known as one of the finest English poets. And Ulysses was first published in 1842. Ulysses, that is the Latin form of the name Odysseus, Odysseus being the hero of Homer's book, The Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, or Ulysses, does ultimately return home after his adventures on the high seas to reclaim his place as king and reclaim his wife. In the poem Ulysses by Tennyson, here Ulysses has been home long enough that he is an old man, but he's getting anxious to get out on the waters again. The form here is a dramatic monologue, and we're going to see this form again next week when we get to Browning's My Last Duchess. In a dramatic monologue, the poem is narrated by one individual and typically does tell some sort of story where the person is revealing things about themselves that aren't just surface things, but we see below the surface as to who they really are. Now, typically, though, with a dramatic monologue, the narrator is untrustworthy, but I think you have to ask the question here, too, with this poem. Is this the typical dramatic monologue? Do we not trust Ulysses and how he is representing himself? The poem is in blank verse. That means there is a regular meter to it, but it does not rhyme. Usually blank verse, though, is written in iambic pentameter. That's the meter. And I point you to a line, too, from the intro to Browning that we're going to see next week. The Norton points out that the language used by Tennyson and other Victorian writers favors smoothly polished texture, elevated diction and subjects, and pleasing liquidity of sound, as in contrast to Browning's poetry. Now, in this poem, Ulysses tells the story. He is restless at home. He is there with his aged wife. He is meting and doling unequal laws unto a savage race, it seems like, even though he obviously is ruling over everybody. He's the king, but it seems like he's out of touch with his people, perhaps because of his age. He says that his son Telemachus is doing pretty well. And it seems like his son would be just fine taking over and ruling things. At the end of, this is the second stanza, he says, he works his work, I mine. We do our own business, but he's pretty pleased with what his son is able to do. And in other words, too, Ulysses is getting the idea, well, it seems like things are going okay. Things can be taken care of by my son. So ultimately, in this last section of the poem, he calls his men together. He is feeling death closing in. He wants to get back out on the waters again where he feels alive, where he can be more of himself. So he calls together his men, and they set off into the sunset to strive to seek to find and not to yield. I think the question is, though, is this a character that whose judgment we can trust? He does seem unable to find happiness at home. I guess he does reveal that to us. I tend to take his word. In many ways, I think that maybe this isn't, it's very different from the dramatic monologue we're going to see with Browning. But he's letting down his guard. Maybe that's a good way of explaining it. He lets down his guard, and we see him not perhaps as maybe a ruler who has some flaws to him. Now, the other poem that we're looking at is the Lotos-Eaters. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show this to you because I am running out of time, but I am very much reminded of Percy Jackson when I think about this poem. You might remember in Percy Jackson, they go to Vegas and they go into a bar, and what's being served by the cocktail waitresses are lotuses. And when and after they eat the lotus, they don't want to leave. They don't want to leave Vegas. They don't want to leave that casino, actually. This poem, a little bit of the technical nature, but keep in mind the Percy Jackson. The rhyme scheme is one that is a standard Spenserian stanza. And I think that the rhyme scheme that's used here, the flow of the lines, is to give us that tone, that feeling of the relaxed slowness of the island of the Lotos-Eaters, that this is an island that Ulysses and his men come upon in their travels. They're drawn to that island. They stop at the island. But the people who are there, the Lotos-Eaters that are there, eat the lotus, which is a drug-like substance that slows down life and makes it like you're in Vegas. In other words, it is based on an episode, actual episode in Homer's Odyssey. The poem is. What happens to the men on the island of the Lotos-Eaters? I just quoted some lines here. It seemed always afternoon. There's a languid air. The charmed sunset lingers. It's a land where all things always seem the same. The Lotos-Eaters are mild-eyed and melancholy. The men are weary, weary, weary. They are just tired of working all the time out there on the ship. And they think, oh, this is maybe a good place to stay. We can relax. We can enjoy ourselves. They ask themselves, why should we be toiling alone? Why should we be the ones who are out there working all the time? Why should life all labor be? Why don't we just stay here? Back at home, they say, it's his life just has gone on too. Dear is the memory of our wedded lives, and dear the last embraces of our wives and their warm tears. But all hath suffered change, for surely now our household hearths are cold. Our sons inherit us. In other words, everybody back at home, life has passed them on, kind of forgotten about them. So why don't they just stay? Now, the ending here, though, they do just stay in the poem, but this is not what happens in the actual story of the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, the men make it back home. I am going to stop here and do part 2 because I want to point you to a couple of things about some of the larger topics addressed here.